Okay, looks like we are live here for our sound for video help session. It is the 13th of January or the 14th of January, depending on where in the world you are right now. And in this episode here, we're going to talk about a couple of things. First, we had a question from one of our friends, Art, and then we also um, are going to talk a little bit about noise reduction when you're doing post-processing. So let me first pull up our question here and see where it went here.
Hey. Hi, Curtis.
Well, hello there, Rick.
I had to switch microphones here. I'm back to my USB mic. The XLR one didn't work.
Okay, fair enough. We'll go with that. All right. The question we had from Art essentially was, hey, what do I do? I'm in a situation where I'm not necessarily ready to make the commitment for Adobe Creative Cloud, or even just Audition, which I believe is somewhere in the range of $20 US per month, and that is that's a fair commitment, and that's a fair question. And then if you get the whole Creative Cloud, I believe that the standard pricing is $50 a month. So that's a a fair chunk of money to spend in a year. And there are, of course, a few options you can pursue that are more affordable. Obviously, there is Audacity. Audacity has some limitations, as we've discussed in the past, but Audacity is a fantastic little app to learn with. What it's missing are some plugins that make it, I think, especially effective for loudness standards, meeting loudness standards, and things of that nature. But overall, it does have some really good capabilities. However, if you're ready to move up from there a little bit, let's talk about an option here. I'm just going to pull up my screen here so you can see this. And let's go ahead and go to Reaper. Reaper is a digital audio workstation, which is a name for an audio editing app that I actually used for quite a while. I stopped using it once I subscribed to Creative Cloud, just because Audition kind of integrated a little bit more smoothly with Premiere, and so that was a little bit easier to use on that front. However, that doesn't make Reaper a bad application by any means, and it is more affordable. So first of all, in terms of cost, you can purchase a discounted license for $60 US. And you can use the discounted license if you're an individual or if you're a business that brings in revenue of 20,000 USD per year or less. Or you can use it if you're an educational nonprofit organization. So this is also a very, very good place to learn. I would say that Reaper is definitely more refined than Audacity, and I find it a little bit easier to work with. I think it's easier on the eyes for starts. Audacity, I don't mean this to come across the wrong way, but to be honest, it's a little bit hard to look at times, and I find it a little easier to dig into the waveforms with something like Reaper. So that's the first thing. Second of all, the downside of Reaper is that, again, most of the people that are using Reaper are musicians or people that are mixing music. So that's one thing you have to consider when it comes time to finding help online. There are a whole series of videos that are available here, even just at the Reaper website, but there are lots of others as well. It's available for both Mac and for PC. It does have a user guide that you can download, which is nice. So you have that as well. There are lots of other resources, themes if you want to use that, but there's several language packs, lots of different options out there. So one thing that is also very interesting about Reaper is that they update it very frequently. In fact, that was one of the things that I almost, I guess I wouldn't say I found annoying, but it almost got to the point where it was annoying, because there were updates. It seemed like every 2 weeks or so, they were updating it quite a lot. And that's not annoying from the standpoint that they're always kind of improving things. They're always doing bug fixes. They're always adding new features. So it's really, really quite nice that way. And it's actually quite sophisticated. So there's a lot to learn here. So that is an option that's definitely worth looking at if you're not in a situation where Adobe Audacity is realistic for you in terms of its cost. And there are a few things that are different about it. It does not have a waveform editor like this, so you're always going to be in multi-track mode. Let me just show you what multi-track mode looks like. Something like this. So again, it's very focused for the most part on um, multi-track, which is typically what you're going to do for music production, although you would also use multi-track very much if you're mixing a film where you have both dialogue, maybe several dialogue tracks, effects tracks, and music tracks. But you will always be in in multi-track mode in Reaper. So it's just kind of a different mindset. It doesn't mean that you don't have the same capabilities. It's just a slightly different mindset. You will use the plugins on each of the individual tracks, and then there's actually some menu settings to actually essentially commit the changes to those tracks. So in essence, you get the same functionality as a waveform editor like this. Again, it's just a slightly different view. So I hope, Art, that is helpful for you. I found Reaper to be very useful. There are some other options as well that I should probably mention. One is that Avid makes a version of Pro Tools that is free. And that's great. Pro Tools is actually typically what they're going to use on large budget films and larger budget, TV and video production. The interesting thing about Pro Tools First, it's called Pro Tools First. That's the free version. The downside I found with it was that you could only use plugins from the Avid store, so I found that to be a little bit limiting. But it is another option as well. I also found Pro Tools to be a little bit arcane in terms of its user interface. And when I downloaded Pro Tools First earlier, I guess it was last year, not this year, but last year in the fall time, they had an update, and the update kind of broke it for a while. And so I don't know if it was just me or other people as well, but I think other people were complaining as well. And it took probably 3 weeks before they fixed it. Now, I'm going to assume that that's not always going to be the case, but there were just some kind of weird things that I personally experienced with Pro Tools with my short experience with it. I have used it in the past as well when I've worked with my brother and in some cases doing music, and he's a Pro Tools user, and I used it there. But it's a very good choice as well, especially if you have aspirations to working in the industry at some point. So Pro Tools First is a great way to get started on that, but then of course you can always upgrade. And Avid is the company that produces Pro Tools. They're kind of in this interesting state where they offer a subscription service, but they also offer, like, you can also just buy the software outright, and that software is actually quite expensive. I think it starts somewhere around $600. You can get the lesser versions are sometimes bundled with hardware. So if you buy an audio interface, sometimes you can get a limited edition of Pro Tools. I'm not sure of all the current state of all that, but that's how it's been in the past. So anyway, there's some other things to consider as well. There are several others out there, but I think and that just sort of reflects my experience there. So I think, again, Reaper is a pretty good choice if you're looking for something that's a little bit more affordable and yet very full featured and very powerful. It does come with a nice set of plugins, including most of the plugins you're going to need for dialogue audio. And of course, things like noise reduction. You can, of course, do compression. It does have normalization. I am not entirely sure on the status of its loudness standards processing. I saw in one of the forums that there was some talk of creating a true peak limiter for Reaper. So I don't know what the current state of that is, but it looks like it's coming as well. But again, it's a bit more refined and more full featured than Audacity, so it's a good choice. All right, let's not belabor that point too long. And let's come back into this here. Okay. Stop screen sharing for a second. Okay, let's talk a little bit about noise reduction in post. And the last 2 weeks, we talked about a couple things. First of all, we talked about measuring noise and the way I typically do that. And I showed you how to do that in Audacity. And then last week, we talked a little bit about some of the things you can do in production to reduce noise. And, obviously it's going to come to mic choice. It's going to come to being able to control any sort of reflections off of walls if you're recording indoors and things of that nature. But sometimes noise ends up in your recording and you have to do something about it in post as well. I don't like to use post processing as a crutch for something I could have done in production, but the reality is that sometimes you do need to do some correction in post as well. So let's go ahead and switch over to Audition here, and let me show you some things about noise reduction in Audition in particular. Obviously, a lot of this will also apply to other things. And in fact, in the latest releases of Audacity, they have a much improved noise reduction effect plugin, and it works almost exactly the same as this. So a lot of this will translate to that. So let's share our screen here again. Okay, here we are in Audition, and this is a clip that one of the subscribers over on the YouTube channel sent me. He's actually trying to troubleshoot a problem with his new microphone here. And we have what he was concerned about here is a little bit of noise, self noise. It seems that is being generated either by the microphone itself, a cable, or the recorder. And again, if as you recall from when we talked about it previously, in terms of measuring the noise here, what I would do is just identify a section of silence. This little peak right here, I just happen to know because I've been working with this audio file for a few minutes, is actually his voice. But we'll select that, which should be just pure noise, nothing else, no other dialogue there. Then I come over to my amplitude statistics panel. If you don't have this, it's just a matter of Window, Amplitude Statistics. And then we'll highlight this area of noise and click Scan Selection. And again, the area that I'm most concerned about here, or in terms of kind of assessing where we're at in terms of noise, is this average RMS amplitude. And you can also look at the maximum and minimum. So this noise here is ranging between minus 52 dB to minus 68 dB. And in fact, if you wanted to see that visually, there's this RMS histogram that can kind of give it kind of a visual picture here. Now, typically when I am processing audio and finishing it, I like to have this noise floor, this average RMS amplitude, what I would call, this is actually more of a practical noise floor, and not so much like a strict scientific noise floor. But I like to have this below minus 60 dB. And in fact, in this case, it technically is, but we haven't done anything with the audio yet. So for example, we haven't loudness normalized it. And right now, if we look at the overall thing, if I highlight the whole thing and scan this selection, you can see our loudness measure right now is minus 31. So this is way too quiet. We're definitely going to have to pull that up. So a couple of things that you can do in terms of noise reduction. And actually, the first one is something that you can do in pretty much any audio editing application. And that is to use a high pass filter. And the way you do that is, let's just come up here to effects. Well, actually, before I do that, let me illustrate one other thing. If I pull this up right here, there's a little bar at the bottom which gives you a spectral view. And the way this view works, let me just pull it all the way up here, actually. Over here on the right-hand side, the y-axis here, you see that we have a scale here that represents the spectral frequencies. So for example, we have 20 kilohertz up here at the top, and we have our low frequencies, 100 and even below that down here at the bottom. All right, so what this actually tells us, and you can see the dialogue here, so these spikes here are obviously the dialogue, but you can see in between the dialogue pieces here, we also have this part right here, this low frequency. There's some low frequency energy there. And oftentimes that low frequency energy is noise. And so one of the things you can actually do is use a high pass filter to get rid of some of that, because the dialogue isn't going to sit down here below minus 100, or sorry, but below 100 hertz. Most of that's just going to be noise. So what we can do is come up to effects, and we're going to come to filter and EQ. And then I'm going to use, in this case, a parametric equalizer. And you can see here, over on the left-hand side here, we have this little button that says HP. That stands for high pass. So this is a high pass filter. And you can see when I turn it on, it actually rolls off some of the lower frequencies here. So it's actually going to reduce some of those lower frequencies, which means it's going to reduce some of this energy right down in here. Now, we can get pretty extreme with this, and we can modify it a little bit. So here, for example, I can change the frequency at which it starts to kick in. And with the gain, I can actually choose to go kind of light, minus 6 dB per octave, or I can go minus 18 dB per octave, and go as crazy as minus 48 dB per octave. And you can see that is a pretty steep curve there. Now, I typically don't like to get too extreme like that. And here's why. This is male voice. So this is male, a guy talking. If I apply that, and it may be hard to see here, but now the waveforms are a little bit asymmetric. You can see, for example, on this one reaches down to almost minus 8 dB, but on this side, on the top, it's not even hitting minus 12. So there is a potential cost here, especially when you're doing male dialogue. Let me just undo this so you can see what it looked like before. Here I go, undo. See how it's not as asymmetric here? And then if I redo that, now it's a little bit more asymmetric. So there is a cost there. What that costs, it doesn't actually necessarily sound different, but you can see, first of all, we've reduced our noise some. And in fact, if we pull up the spectral view, this is a little less intense than it was before. We haven't totally removed it, but we've definitely reduced it. And in fact, if we measure it, let's go ahead and highlight this section again. Remember, before we were, somewhere in the minus 59 or 60 range. If we scan it now, we're at minus 70. So we've taken 10 dB out of that overall. And in fact, if we look at the histogram here, it's looking much, much healthier. We don't really get anything until you really kind of hit the minus 65, 66 range right here. So that's actually done a lot to reduce some of the noise. Of course, again, the cost is now this waveform is a little asymmetric. This will not generally happen quite as much, I've found, with female voice as it will with male voice for whatever reason. But the problem with it is not so much that it's asymmetric, because that doesn't really affect the sound quality, I don't think. However, what it does is it does rob you of headroom. So, for example, when we go to loudness normalize it, notice that we're already starting to clip here, whereas on the opposite side of this waveform, we're still at minus 3 dB. And in fact, if I undo that, let's just go ahead and come up to this file. We'll grab this and put it in our match loudness panel down here. Again, if you don't have that, that's just a matter of coming up here and ticking match loudness. We drop it in here. Let's go ahead and get our target loudness at minus 19 LUFS because this is a mono file. Tolerance 0.5 is fine, and max true peak level minus 1.5. That's great. Let's go ahead and run it. And looks like we're in pretty good shape here. It actually did not. Oh, it actually does look like it's clipping it off here. So look at that. It's sort of, if I zoom in here, you can see it is affecting that waveform to some extent. So that is just an illustration of the cost of using a high pass filter on male voice, at least. So just something to keep in mind. It's still very effective. Again, we did manage some of that noise pretty effectively, but it did do this. Now, there are ways to fix that. You can use a phase rotation plugin. Most audio editing apps or digital audio workstations do not have a phase rotation plugin built in. You have to usually download those separately. And in fact, let me just illustrate here since we have a couple of minutes. I'm going to use RX5. This is an application called Isotope RX5 for those who are not familiar with it. This is a very expensive app, so I realize this is not something everyone can afford, but I just want to illustrate to you what this does. So I can open up this channel ops, and there's an adaptive phase rotation option in here. So again, notice that there's more, the amplitude of this waveform is larger on one side than it is on the other, but once I process it, it evens it back up again. So I have all that headroom back again, which means I can loudness normalize it without affecting the waveform at all. So that's just an illustration here of how you can fix that potentially. And there are other plugins that do that are a little bit less expensive that we can talk about at some point in the future as well. So, all right, I'm going to undo that. Undo. Okay, there we are. There we're back at our start. So again, our noise floor, if I look at amplitude statistics and I scan it, whoops, we are sitting at about minus 60. I know that's going to be a problem because once I come in here, so again, let's loudness normalize it to minus 19 LUFS. Go ahead and run that. Okay. That's great. Now we're loud enough, but look at this noise. This noise is even worse. Brings the noise up too. So let's come back into our amplitude statistics and remeasure that. It's now sitting at minus 48, which is problematic. My rule of thumb is I typically try to get it down below minus 60 dB. And one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about noise reduction is it really should be noise reduction. You're just really trying to manage it. You're not trying to 100% and completely eliminate it, because if you do attempt to completely eliminate it, you're also going to start affecting the dialogue, and you're going to create some problems with the dialogue itself. It'll start cutting into the dialogue, pulling some of the dialogue away, and it'll start to sound very, very robotic and unnatural. So definitely make sure you're approaching this as we want to reduce this noise, not completely and utterly remove it. So, all right. So what we can do here in Adobe Audition, and again in Audacity, this works very similarly. We come up to Effects, Noise Reduction, and we're going to choose this noise reduction process. Now, you'll notice here I highlighted this noise section again. Once I've done that, I can click Capture Noise Print, and that gives us this display here. Then what I'll do is I'll select the entire file because I want to apply this noise reduction to the entire file. And you have a few different sliders here. There are two main sliders. There's the noise reduction slider. This is the sensitivity, or which parts of the noise floor you're going to affect. And then you also have the reduce noise by. And typically what I suggest as a starting point is probably put this reduce by at about 6 dB and start with the noise reduction at about 50%. Now, what you can do next, and what I can't necessarily illustrate here, unfortunately, because we're on a Google Hangout, but what I typically do is I actually will press play and listen through it. And while I'm listening, I will tweak this noise reduction slider right here. Again, starting at 50%. One thing you can do that also is very, very helpful in Adobe Audition's noise reduction plugin here is you can output the noise only, which is super helpful, because then what you'll hear through your headphones or your monitors is just the noise that it will be removing if you were to apply it. And what that can also help you do is, as you play through dialogue, if you're hearing a lot of dialogue come through while you have this checked, that means you're cutting into the dialogue too much. So that's a really helpful feature as well. So what I'll do here is I've actually kind of, again, I'll just play through it here. You won't hear this, but let me just kind of tweak it a little bit. Okay, that's going to work for me. So I'll go ahead and apply that. Now we can measure our noise floor again. We're now at minus 55, so I may have to go a little heavier. Now I have a couple options. I could go back and just undo and reapply it with more noise reduction, or I could do a second pass. So I think I'm going to go ahead and do a second pass. I like the approach of doing just a little bit each time, because you have a less tendency to affect things. And so what we'll do is I've highlighted the noise section again. I'm going to go ahead and capture the noise print again. And again, I'll listen through. I'll go ahead and select the entire file. I'll listen through. Again, you won't be able to hear this, but I'm going to listen through and make sure that I'm not cutting into the dialogue too much. Yeah, again, these settings are really going to be good for us here, 50% and reduced by 6 dB. So go ahead and hit that. Let's see where our noise floor is sitting now. We're now at minus 63. And if we look at the RMS amplitude, it does still range from 55 and up. It's nice if you can get all of it under minus 60. We could do another pass if we wanted to. In fact, let's quickly do that. And what you need to kind of experiment with as well is, doing one pass versus multiple passes like this. Let's go ahead and capture the noise print, select the entire file. Actually, I'll just listen through. Still sounding pretty good. Go ahead and select the entire file and apply. Measure my noise floor again. We're now at minus 70. And if we look at the histogram now, we've got everything under minus 60. So things are good there. And when I listen to this, again, I can't unfortunately do it on the Google Hangout here to play back for you. But when I listen to this, the voice still sounds very natural, but we don't have all that hiss. And in fact, if we look at the spectral display here, you will notice, first of all, this section here is much darker than it used to be. So there's a lot less energy there. And we have also managed to take care of some of this lower frequency noise as well. So there is a look at how to do that in Adobe Audition. Now, again, in Audacity, it's very, very similar. There is a noise reduction plugin. It does the same thing in terms of capturing the noise print. So it's all very straightforward here. Let me show you one other thing here, just as a kind of item of interest. This is how I often do it when I'm working on my corporate pieces. I will often come in here. I'll send the audio over to RX5, again, isotope, which we talked about a second ago. Just make sure you guys are seeing that okay. Yep, you're getting it. Okay. So in this case here, I might actually do some EQ. And here I've got this high pass filter here. Go ahead and process. Interesting thing that I found on this, which is fascinating to me, and I don't understand it entirely. Did you notice when I processed that, the waveform did not become asymmetric? I don't understand why that is exactly, but for some reason, this EQ just doesn't seem to affect the audio that way, which is really kind of fascinating. But then there's also this denoise plugin. This one is amazing. This one is nice because I can just preview here. Again, you won't be able to hear it on this thing, but I can set 2 sliders, a threshold and a reduction. Typically, I'll put this again somewhere between 4 and 6. Leave the threshold at its default of 0, preview it. And that's looking pretty solid there. Go ahead and apply that. And then I would go ahead and actually let's do some loudness normalization here. Let's go to minus 19.5, minus 1.5 true peak. See where we're sitting and how it's looking. It's definitely still there, so I'll probably want to do some more passes at that. Do our denoise again. Go ahead and process that. And boom, looks like it's doing pretty well. Send it back to Audition. Receive it in Audition. Okay, if we measure it now. Yep, we've got it managed. And in fact, you can see it actually managed it differently. That is one of the most advanced noise reduction plugins on the market. And it does really, really well. So there are a couple of examples of how you can do noise reduction in post-production. Again, you can do it in Audacity. So for those of you that are using Audacity, you can do that. In Reaper, you can do it as well, which we talked about earlier in this episode. In Reaper, note that there is not a separate plugin for noise reduction. It's actually in the Reafir plugin, R-E-A-F-I-R. There are lots of tutorials online if you want to see how to do that. It's very, very similar process where you get a noise print and then you apply it to the clip. So all really helpful. Again, this doesn't provide an excuse. Just important to keep in mind a couple of things. Number one, it doesn't provide an excuse to get poor quality production audio. So you definitely want to focus still on getting good production quality audio. Also, don't get too hung up on trying to eliminate every last bit of noise, because again, you'll start to affect the dialogue sound and it won't be an awesome sound. So be real careful about that as well. So just a couple of things to keep in mind there. All right, I think we're good on the sharing there. Rick, did you have any questions that you wanted to discuss here before we wrap up?
Yeah, Curtis, a question just on what you're talking about before. I don't know if you can put the screen back. But I know I've done a lot of podcasts before, just straight audio. And if they're short enough, instead of doing the straight, noise reduction and going to something like isotope, I'll just highlight those areas that are almost flat and drop the level down.
Yep.
And it doesn't affect the audio, but one other thing it does is it'll get rid of breathing noises and mouth noises. And if you've got a 10-minute file, you don't want to do that. You want to use a noise reduction. But I think it's probably another thing to look at for audio for video is if you have something like that, you just highlight it. And I like your point of not bringing it down, because Audacity has something that says silence. When I first started doing my audio, I just hit silence instead of dropping the level down. I said, this sounds weird. What's wrong?
Yeah. Definitely starts to sound unnatural. Yeah, and that's one thing to be careful of. If the noise floor is not too bad, that can definitely be a really good strategy. What can be a little tricky sometimes, though, is if you do it that way, One thing that still will come through a little bit is if you can actually hear the noise during the dialogue, it won't necessarily take care of that issue. Um, but yeah, if there are just extraneous noises in particular, like um, breaths in between phrases, sort of mouth noises like lip smacking, and sometimes tongues make strange noises as well. But yeah, that's a great strategy for taking care of those things as well. Thanks for that, Rick.
Yeah, and a lot of times you need both because it'll be noisy within the dialogue, but in a lot of cases, if it's just in between the pauses in the dialogue, or if you've got a music track in the background that's going to mess things out or something, that's it's another thing that it's kind of a cheap and dirty thing to do, but something to look at if it's a really short file.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Curtis.
All righty. I think that brings us to the end of our session here. Just so that you're aware of, in terms of what's coming up next here, I was feeling a little under the weather early this week. I'm starting to feel better now. But I am still working on my next episode here for the YouTube channel, and we'll be comparing 3 microphones for those that are into these kind of microphones. This is the Aperture A-Lav. This is a $35 US microphone lavalier that plugs into your phone or into a camera. One that we reviewed more recently was the Gora lavalier. This is about a $20 to $25 US microphone. Again, plugs into your smartphone. And then, of course, there's the Rode SmartLav Plus, which also plugs into your smartphone. A lot of people have been asking, okay, which one should I get? Well, what I'm going to do is just a quick audio comparison of those. So for those of you that are interested in, kind of hearing the difference between those, you'll at least get to hear it on my voice. Every mic is going to respond differently on every different person's voice, so it's not an ultimate test by any means. But for those that are interested in that, that'll be coming up a little bit later this week. I've also been working on the post-processing class a little bit more, so that's coming up, and I don't have a date for that yet. I apologize. I'm really trying to put all the best effort into that, so it's a really, really solid, worthwhile course for you guys, for those that are interested in signing up for that eventually. And also, I'm very excited that this week I ordered some acoustic treatment for my room here, for my mixing room, which is really just sort of a converted downstairs basement room in my house. And so we'll be getting some acoustic treatment from GIK Audio, which I'll probably talk about a little bit more in the future, and I'll probably do some tests here, both in terms of measuring the room to see how it changes from before to after. And I know that before it's pretty poor. I actually did some measurements already, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that works, and then also be able to record and hear how different it sounds just to your ears as well. So looking forward to that as well. I'd like to thank everyone who joined today. Thanks for those with questions. Rick, thanks for joining us here today as well, and we'll talk to everyone again next time.
Hey, thanks, Curtis.